We're going to move on to our next question. And Supervisor Weiner, you'll start with your answer. What would you do in Sacramento to enable middle-income families and individuals to live and stay in San Francisco?
This is really the question of the day on so many different levels. It is getting harder and harder for a lot of people, and particularly middle-income people and people raising children, to be able to remain in our city, and it threatens the fabric of our city. So first, the state, as we discussed before, has to do much more for housing, both creating incentives for local communities to create enough housing, including affordable housing, and more money to invest in housing. That is absolutely crucial. But we have to go beyond that. I recently authored legislation making San Francisco the first place in the country to guarantee and require fully paid parental leave. No parent should ever have to choose between bonding with a new child and putting food on the table. We need to take that work statewide. We know that parental leave and family leave in general is a huge need for a lot of people, including middle-class people, in terms of being able to sustain a family. We have to do more for our schools, and that is also a real challenge. If someone feels like they don't want to have their kids in the public schools, and they need to try to afford private schools or move to a different community, that doesn't work. We need to make sure, as California used to be one of the best funded school systems in the country and is now languishing in the 40s, that we move out of the 40s and move up and have an education system where every single child in every community, in every school, can get a high quality public education and access these 21st century jobs that we are creating. We want our own kids to have those jobs, and we want to support families. And we need much better early childhood education. We need to make sure that we have so many two-income families, because people have to work, that people are able to have their kids taken care of, and that they can have kids and have healthy families and work to support those families. And the state needs to play more of a role.
Thank you, Supervisor Weiner. Supervisor Kim.
I'm really proud of the fact that I've been the first supervisor on this board that's fought for and negotiated middle-income housing and new market rate developments here that is being built and constructed in San Francisco. This is the first step that we need to take. And second, I ask for all of your support for Proposition C, which has been put by the board unanimously and by our mayor, that is not only going to ask our market rate developers to build affordable housing at 15%, as they used to, but on top of that, to also build 10% middle-income housing with the affordable that they are building. This is the type of work that we need to do. We need to increase, of course, the funding for middle-income housing from the state level. In fact, much of middle-income housing is not built currently today because federal and state often doesn't match our dollars here locally when we decide to build housing at higher income brackets. That needs to change. And two, we need to ask our local market rate developers to do more. They make millions and millions of dollars in the city that we live in and that we love. And we can ask them to help share the value and profits that they're able to generate through this very city that we all help to grow by building more affordable and middle-income housing. Second, funding education at greater levels is absolutely key to supporting middle-class families, and I'm proud to have authored the reauthorization of the Public Education Enrichment Fund that is built bringing over $77 million into our schools and also into our pre-K programs as well. These are the very dollars that are bringing in art teachers, PE teachers, college counselors, and nurses for the very first time, making up for where the state has failed with the passage of Proposition 13 back in 1978. And finally, as I mentioned before, we need to work on investing in higher education. City College should be free, not just here in San Francisco, as we are going to make it this upcoming November, but throughout the state of California, as it was in 1983. And we have to work on bringing fees and tuitions back down. As I mentioned, we used to subsidize almost 80%. Can I just finish this point? We used to subsidize 80% of your tuition if you went to a UC 30 years ago. We now only subsidize 37% if you attend a UC today. That needs to change.
Thank you, Supervisor Kim. Okay. Supervisor Kim, the next question. The state and Bay Area and the state, Bay Area, and city have a significant shortfall of transportation infrastructure funding. We passed a $500 million bond in November of 2014, and there will be a large, approximately $3 billion BART bond for this year, and we're still lacking funding. How big of a funding gap remains, and what will you do at the state level to address this to ensure funds come to San Francisco?
So there is roughly a $10.1 billion need in terms of transit infrastructure at roughly $4 billion a year. And this leaves roughly a $5 billion gap in operational deficit and deficiencies. It is absolutely important that we continue to support bonds that help support the future investment in infrastructure capital in our BART, in our Caltrain, and our regional transit systems, that we continue to invest locally and muni, both in operating costs and also in capital, and that we ask our developers to contribute to the jobs and housing that they are creating here. This past year, Supervisor John Avalos had an amendment to the Transportation Sustainability Fee, where we are finally assessing a fee on residential developers to contribute to our transportation needs. This amendment would have brought in $30 million in one-time funding to our transportation fund and close to $2.4 million annually. I supported this measure because I believe that our developers can do more, not just to build affordable housing, but also to cover our transit infrastructure needs. Supervisor Weiner did not support this. I think that there are many ways that we can look to building more and to make sure that we are providing strong support, whether it is systems like high-speed rail and electrification of Caltrain, and of course the downtown extension. And that takes political will, but it also takes a willingness to invest from the taxpayers, the state government, and also from our private sector partners.
Okay, thank you, Supervisor Kim. And Supervisor Weiner, you'll have 2 minutes plus 30 seconds for rebuttal.
Thank you very much. It takes a lot of what my father would call chutzpah to criticize my commitment to funding public transportation. I have been the leading voice in City Hall to support increased funding in public transportation. I have worked incredibly hard, whether it's authoring Proposition B, whether it's campaigning for the transportation bond that we did a few years ago. And it really matters. We built the BART system and the Market Street subway in the 1970s. And we've not added an additional inch of subway capacity since then. And you only have to look at what's happening with BART right now to learn what happens when you don't invest in public transportation. We have massive capital needs in our transit systems, and I work every day with BART, and we're going to go out with a BART bond this year, so that BART, which has almost $10 billion in capital needs in the next decade, actually has the resources it needs to move this region around. I work closely with Caltrain to make sure we are electrifying that system, and so that people can get between here and the South Bay on public transportation. And I work with Muni to make sure that we are purchasing new buses and replacing all of the infrastructure and expanding service, and I'm proud of the work that we've been able to do. And I'm really honored to be able to represent San Francisco on the Metropolitan Transportation Commission and to work with regional transportation players. And I'm proud to have the endorsement of all three of the big city mayors in San Francisco, including Mayor Schaaf and Mayor Liccardo, as well as Mayor Lee, because they know about the regional approach that I take to transportation and housing. I do want to just respond to what Supervisor Kim just said. I have spent about 5 years to come up with and to author and to move forward legislation for the first time to require residential developers to pay transit impact development fees. For 35 years they didn't have to pay. I did the legislation that requires them to pay it, generating $45 million a year from our transit impact development fee under legislation that I authored. Supervisor Avalos authored the amendment that she referred to say, no, it shouldn't be 45 million, it should be 47 million. And we had worked for 5 years on that legislation, And to suggest that the difference between 45 million and 47 million is somehow significant is ridiculous. Only one candidate in this race has fought for public transportation funding, and it's me.
A rebuttal of 30 seconds for Supervisor Kim.
By the way, I do not question Supervisor Weiner's commitment to transportation. He is very committed. What I question is his ability to negotiate hard with those that have private sector interests with millions of dollars that they can contribute more to our transportation system. It's not just an additional $2 million a year. Yes, there was also $30 million in one-time fees, and 6 members of the board felt that the larger developers could pay more than the smaller developers, and we supported a prorated fee where larger developers would pay more, therefore by generating more revenue for transportation.
Okay, thank you, Supervisor Kim. The next question is for Supervisor Weiner on climate change is real. Can you talk about your experience in San Francisco and tell us what you can bring to Sacramento to help you keep California on the cutting edge of reducing our carbon footprint?
Absolutely, and this is a really important question. Climate change is an existential threat to our planet, and California has played a cutting-edge role, and it needs to continue that, and I will provide that leadership. And I have done significant work around climate change and also the drought in San Francisco, and I'm proud to be the only candidate in this race endorsed by the California League of Conservation Voters. We need more renewable energy in this state. I authored legislation, as I mentioned, to require solar on the roofs of new buildings. We need to move aggressively toward more renewable energy away from fossil fuels. We need to adopt the legislation that died last year to require that we reduce petroleum use in California by 50%. We need an oil extraction fee in California. We need to ban fracking in California. And we need to make sure that we are aggressively expanding public transportation and compact housing and walkable, bikeable, transitable, if that's a word, neighborhoods, because let's always be clear that transportation and housing are absolutely key to addressing climate change. We must massively invest in transit and rail, and that will be a high priority for me in Sacramento. And we have to stop the housing sprawl and have good, compact urban housing. And we need to stop trying to shut down housing production in our city, and that is why I opposed the Mission Housing Moratorium. Supervisor Kim co-authored the Mission Housing Moratorium. That was a step in the wrong direction, and the voters wisely rejected it. We need to do all of these things if we are going to meaningfully address climate change.
Thank you, Supervisor Weiner. Supervisor Kim gets 2 minutes and 30 seconds, 30 seconds for you.
Thank you. Dealing with climate change is one of the greatest challenges of our lifetime. And to me, the environmental issue is also a social justice issue as well, because we know that it disproportionately impacts our low-income communities and communities of color. Now, there are several things that we need to do. We need to keep California on track of reducing our carbon emissions by 50%. And here at the state, we have very aggressive goals to achieve that, and we need to make sure that we stay on course. Second, we need to increase the amount of renewable energy that we are generating here in the state. And we need to prepare our grid and our infrastructure to absorb more alternative renewable energy sources, solar, wind, and others. Third, we need to build smart growth and dense neighborhoods. We need to build more housing and more affordable housing, not just here in San Francisco, but throughout the state of California. And we certainly need other counties to do their fair share. And so one of the things that's very important at the state level is that while we create many incentives to counties and jurisdictions to create jobs, we don't create as many incentives for them to build housing as well. So as counties and cities build and more jobs and encourage companies to come in, they're not building the housing to house those very employees that are coming to the area. That is why we are experiencing a housing crisis today. Supervisor Weiner brought up something that was called the Mission Moratorium, authored by my colleague, Supervisor David Campos. I always thought it was a misnomer to call it the moratorium. It was rather a pause. We were simply asking that for 18 months, that the planning department actually look at the mission and figure out not only how to build more housing, but how to build more affordable and middle-income housing as well. There was no moratorium. It never said we will never build again. It said we never put studies and plans in place to ensure that we're not building more than single-digit affordable housing, which is what District 9 is building today. Here in District 6, we are the closest to building 30% affordable and middle-income housing. I would not support a moratorium here in this district, but when we are seeing that we are not building enough in other districts, there's nothing wrong with taking a pause and studying to how build more.
Thank you, Supervisor Kim. Supervisor Weiner, rebuttal. Okay, very good. Okay, we'll move on. Supervisor Kim, next question. How would you generate more funding for K through 12 grade schools, and how should those funds be used?
Sure. So an idea that I know both of us support is the reforming of Proposition 13. Since the passage of Proposition 13 back in 1978, we've seen a third of our funding for our public schools K through 12 wiped out. We have seen us lose art teachers, as I mentioned before, PE teachers, counselors, nurses, librarians, all the things that property taxes used to pay for, but are now viewed as extraneous amenities in many of our schools as we struggle to make sure that we continue to teach reading and math. Now, the split role of Prop 13 is very important because, as we've seen over the last 40 years, commercial property owners are reducing their base in terms of how they pay into our public school program. In fact, commercial property used to make up 45% of our property tax base. It now only makes up 28%, while residential property owners' burden went up from 55% to 72% of this tax base. We've seen commercial property owners change hands and ownerships, but use different paper guises to make sure that they don't see an increase on their properties. In fact, the Transamerica building pays far less in property taxes than your average single-family homeowner. They are not paying their fair share. But if we are able to get these investments back in our schools, we should absolutely focus them on the very things that keep children in school, and that is the arts, that is PE and athletics, it is our library program, it is our after-school program, and frankly, it's also nutrition and school lunch. Many of our kids come to school every day hungry, and they leave hungry again. We can do more to invest in all of this to make sure that our kids are healthier and staying strong, but also on track to graduate. I'm proud of the fact that I authored a supplemental to help get our sophomores and juniors that were not on track to graduate at 8 through 3 levels the money that it needed to get them back on track. My opponent did not support that supplemental. And I think it's important that when we have additional money come into our funds, that we prioritize our schools and our kids.
Thank you, Supervisor Kim. Supervisor Weiner, sounds like 2 minutes and 30 seconds.
Thank you.
Okay.
A budget is a reflection of our values. When you look at California, where we are with public education, as I mentioned before, we used to be right near the top of the 50 states, and we're now, I think we've gone up a couple slots, but we're still in the low 40s. And it is embarrassing to the state, and it's unacceptable, and it reflects a lack of adequate commitment to our kids, to make sure that our kids are going to succeed. And I'll tell you, one of the most fulfilling things that I do as a district supervisor, which is also one of the most frustrating, and I bet that Supervisor Kim will agree, is when a school in my district will come to me and say, for example, we're losing this after-school program. Can you get us money in the budget to help save it? Which I've done. Or we don't have a reading specialist in our school, even though almost half the kids are behind on reading. Can you help us get money for a reading specialist? Which I've done. Or we don't have a water bottle filling station in our school. Can you help us get money for it? Which I've done. And that is incredibly fulfilling to do that. It is also unbelievably frustrating. Why should our school district have to come to the Board of Supervisors to hire a reading specialist or to pay for an after-school program or a water bottle filling station? We should be funding our schools like we mean it, understanding this is the future of our state. We need a split role. Supervisor Kim and I agree on that. It is not okay that the Bank of America building is treated the same or even better than someone's single-family home or condominium. We need to renew Proposition 30, and God bless Governor Brown for campaigning for Prop 30 in 2012 for a tax increase which largely funds our schools and helps stabilize schools in California. We have to get it renewed. We must restore the vehicle license fee to what it was for 50 years before Arnold Schwarzenegger slashed it. And those funds, I believe, should go largely to transportation, but schools should benefit as well. We have a lot of work to do. In terms of that supplemental that Supervisor Kim referred to, we all supported that funding. But instead of waiting for the budget process, which is the best way to do funding, to view everything together, where I have supported significant funding for all sorts of educational programs, it was done in the middle of the year, and I just didn't support that approach.
Thank you, Supervisor Weiner. Did you want to?
Yeah,
Yeah, 30 seconds.
So
for Supervisor
actually,
Kim.
I tried to get that budget supplemental in the June process, and I was asked to wait because it was a state add back. And so I introduced that following the September of that year. And the reason why I did this was this. In the previous 6 months, we had something called Proposition H, the Public Education Enrichment Fund, which gives money to our schools, but when we project a deficit, we can pull back the 25% that we would normally give to our schools, and we say, we'll give it to you later. Now, after June 30th, after we made our decision on the budget, all this money came into our budget that we were not expecting. So I came back and I said, we deserve to give a supplemental to our schools, and it should go to the very kids that are not on track to graduate.
Thank you, Supervisor Kim. The next question comes from the audience, and Supervisor Weiner, you will start with you. What do you see as the main issue facing State Senate District 11, and how do you plan to tackle that issue?
There are a lot of issues, but I think first and foremost is housing. And you know, as I mentioned, I moved here in 1997 as a 27-year-old kid who with enormous student debt, and I was by no means a low-income worker, but I was not making an enormous amount of money. And I was able to rent a one-bedroom apartment with a view in the heart of the Castro. I was paying $1,050 a month, and I could not believe how much I was paying compared to what I had paid in Philadelphia, where I had moved here from. That would be a $3,500 apartment today. I am so, it is so difficult, and I know you all have heard this too. When I hear from my neighbors, people who have lived in my neighborhood who I've seen and known for years, particularly seniors, who say, you know what, my landlord started painting my building and I'm terrified. You should be happy when your landlord is painting your building, not terrified. Yet that is where we have come. I know too many people who have been evicted or displaced, too many people who are at risk, and this is also about the next generation of 27-year-olds coming to San Francisco to make a life for themselves, and where are they going to live? We have to stabilize people in their housing, reforming the Ellis Act. I've done legislation locally to make sure that tenants get better notice when their landlords are going to try to demolish their unit. But we also will never, ever, ever solve this housing crisis unless we create enough housing. San Francisco has 200,000 more people than we had in 1980. We have been growing by a net 10,000 people a year. The Bay Area is going to have 2 million net additional residents by 2040. And if we don't get it together and start actually creating sustainable, transit-oriented housing in a significant way in San Francisco and in the Bay Area, the $3,500 average rent we see today is going to start looking cheap.
Thank you, Supervisor Weiner. Supervisor Kim?
Affordability is absolutely the #1 issue here in the district, not just in San Francisco, but in Daly City and Colma as well. We are seeing widespread evictions growing at 100, 200, 300% from where it was many years ago. And we are seeing many more people ending up on our streets because they simply cannot afford to rent a place in the city that they work in. This despite the fact that they actually have jobs. The fastest growing demographic in our homeless count here in San Francisco, in LA, in New York, and in cities across the country are working families. They're families with jobs that are working, but they just simply cannot afford to rent in the city that they work in. We must do more to build housing, but it can't just be build, build, build. Because if we just allow developers to build, 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 they will only build market rate and luxury housing. They will only build the most expensive housing possible so they can generate the most profits for their developments. Where I differentiate myself from my opponent is that not only do I support building more, I fight hard to make sure that those developers also build affordable and middle-income housing. And I'm proud of the fact that I do that in almost every single deal in development in my district. And I can't name a single development in District 8 where they have built more than they were obligated to. I always go to the mat, and I think more than asking where our values and our priorities lie, it's asking who is willing to fight harder against big special interests to make sure they are contributing more to our city and our state and our community to make this a more equitable and healthy city for all San Franciscans.
Thank you, Supervisor Kim. Would you like Supervisor Weiner, 30 seconds for Supervisor Weiner.
Sure. First of all, we have a project in District 8 that is producing almost 40% affordable housing, the 55 Laguna project. It's producing about 160 units of affordable housing. But I think it's also important to be accurate. And Supervisor Kim has talked about how she forced multiple developers to do 40% affordable. And let's just be very clear, and I'm not disputing the quality of these developments. These are developments that I supported. But the developers are not doing 40%. The developers are providing 20%, and the taxpayers are paying for the other 20%. Now that's fine. It's fine to have the developers put in some, taxpayers put in the rest. It's all good. But it's very different than saying, I negotiated and forced these developers to put in 40% when those developers are not putting in 40%. That is just absolutely false. You don't have to believe me. Look at Joe Eskenazi's article.
Supervisor Kim, 30 seconds, please.
55 Laguna was decided before Scott or I was on the Board of Supervisors, so that's one. But two, there's not a single taxpayer dollar going into 5M or into the Giants project. What we plowed back into those projects was something that we fought for, and that is that we asked developers to pay a jobs housing linkage fee when they build commercial and office. And all we did was, like we do with the jobs housing linkage fee, is that we plowed it back to build more affordable housing. Now, we could have built it somewhere else in another part of the city or another project, but we decided that we wanted to build it on site or close to those projects. There's not a single taxpayer dollar that's going into either of those projects. That is 100% privately funded, the entire 40%.
Thank you, Supervisor Kim.